Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we start to take a look at some draft prospects. And we begin with a position of need. I think when you break it down to the three spots, all of them are positions of need for the Bucks, but a rather big position of need, the bigs. We take a look at some of the names linked to the Bucks, who would make the most sense, who is likely to be there, and who would just be the best fit. What's the best value find as we start to think about life after Brooke Lopez and potentially Bobby Portis? We get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis, and we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. As always, it's free and available wherever you find your podcasts. You can get us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Some of you joining us on YouTube as we speak, as another treat for the listeners and viewers. Camille, a live show that we're doing to break down these bigs prospects in the upcoming draft. Upcoming as in 1 week from today, it begins. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $200 in bonus bets. All you got to do is win a $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So as I mentioned, Camille, we're doing this in three parts here. We're going to take a look at the bigs. Tomorrow's show, we're going to focus on the forwards, wings. And Friday, we are going to take a look at the guards. And these are the names that are going to be possible options for the Bucks, linked to the Bucks. We're not doing a deep dive on everyone that's out there and the names that would not be possible. We're not doing anything on Alex Sarr today. Not going to touch on Reed Shepherd on Friday's show. You get the picture, but starting to get the primer out there of what is going to be available, we think, for the Bucks. So I suppose we should start there in that I know mock drafts vary every single year, but this one seems like there's far more variance than what we're accustomed to in recent years. And I think the logic behind that is fairly simple. Everybody has heard the write-ups on this draft so far and the value that is going to be available in it, the comps to last year's draft and potentially next year's draft. So with that in mind, you get the sense that there is going to be a lot of variance. And this one's just coming down to how teams view players, what specific traits and skill sets you see that you say, no, I don't know. I think this will work at this level, opposed to what we've seen for the most part where, you always have your surprises, but for the most part, okay, this guy's number one. This guy's a top three. This guy's a lottery. Not to say you don't have those instances this year. It just seems like they are fewer and far between.
Yeah, the consensus just isn't there as we've seen in drafts of old, which is part of why I'm looking forward to this year's draft. I think it's going to be really entertaining because there isn't a lot of consensus where you can look at big boards. You can see just the variance on how players are ranked. You can look at mock drafts. Like we talked about it before we went live of some of our prep before this show and saying how all of these mock drafts, like looking at 10 different mock drafts and seeing various names in every single one. It's one of those drafts where it's really going to come down, like you mentioned, to team preference and how they organize their particular board. Because even someone like Zach Edey, who we'll talk about a little bit, there are some people who are really high on him, see him as a lottery, selection. Other people who are like, he might fall to the end of the first round for all we know. And it's like interesting that it's just such a wide variance on all of these prospects, which probably adds to the perception of it being a weaker draft class because there's just not much consensus throughout it. But from what I've been able to learn and read, it does seem like there are going to be some pretty solid role players, which every draft produces at some level. So hopefully at 23, if the Bucks keep that pick, they can find somebody who can contribute.
All right, so what do you say we dig into these names here? We put together a list of a handful of players that seem to make the most sense for the Bucks. And I think there's two that are probably the man. I hope so. And those names, interestingly enough, are the two that I've seen linked to them most often. Now, a lot is going to change between today and 1 week from today as teams start to wrap up their interviews and workouts and everything else. And you always have those teams that are operating in stealth mode where it's, oh, they really like this guy and they never tipped their hand. So you are going to see guys that were linked to the Bucks if, hey, he's probably going to be available at 23 or somewhere around there, that end up going 13 or something like that. So we've compiled our list as of this moment of, okay, who realistically could be there? We got a handful of them. So let's start with one of those guys that I said makes the most sense. And I've seen, granted it's not an exact science, but in mock drafts going to the Bucks multiple times. And that is Kel'el Ware of Indiana. So you see the size, a 7-footer. You see the overall skill set with what he was able to do as a shooter, as a scorer around the rim, most importantly, as a rim protector as well. And I think the one thing that stood out to me the most about Kel'el Ware is, well, two things, I should say, because one of them is going to be important, assuming you can get him and you play him next year with one player specifically that's on the team. And that was his play in the pick and roll of both roll man and somebody that can just pick and pop and knock down those shots. He was a 40% three-point shooter in college, has a little bit of a post-up game as well, which, look, the league is obviously headed away from that. It's still nice to have. Look at what Kristaps Porzingis did for the Boston Celtics. But that other thing that I was talking about was his lack of fouls and the discipline that he brings, avoiding those fouls, defending, physically defending without committing fouls. That is so rare, but so very important for young players. And I mean, just go back throughout the course of this past season and the conversations that we had about Andre Jackson Jr. Very adept defensively, aggressive, and you loved everything that he brought. The one thing we kept saying was, man, he's just got to cut down on the fouls. Comping the college game to the pro game is obviously very, very different. But that was the one thing, or one of the handful of things that stood out to me the most about Kel'el Ware.
Yeah, listen, with Ware, he, as you mentioned, just he's a specimen. Like, to be his size but have the fluidity in his game that he has, it's really impressive to watch. Now, Khalil, his first year at Oregon, I believe it was, there were concerns about his motor, and that's been like the biggest knock on Ware.
Physicality, motor.
Yeah, like, does he have it? Because there were stretches in college where he could disappear in a whole half. You don't see him. And this apparently even goes back to his time in high school, where it's just kind of like there are just moments where the effort kind of waves, the focus kind of waves, and you just don't notice him out there anymore. But for everything about that, I love his touch around the rim. He has really good hands around the rim. Like, he's a lob threat with his size. You mentioned the fact that he shot over 40% from three last season, which I'm curious to see how that translates to the NBA, because his first year in college, he shot about 27% from three while he was at Oregon, while he put up like 6 attempts a game. So he was getting them up there at Oregon at a very low clip. And then this past year, he was able to get him over 40% on fewer attempts per game. He's like, he was more well-rounded as a player in his second year. And like I mean, his hands really stood out to me because he's a lob threat. Even times where he doesn't catch the lob, like to dunk it, he has just like this finesse where he can kind of catch it and still finish around the rim regardless. Him being able to have that three-point shot is really, really good. I'm really curious to see how that stands when he gets to the NBA. And of course, there's some concerns about just size and strength, but a lot of players do have those concerns coming out of college. So he is somebody who, of all the bigs that we are going to be talking about, to tip my hand, he is the one I'm the most excited about with his fit for the Bucks. My concern with him at this point is that he has been a really big riser through the pre-draft process. So I'm a little worried now that he has played himself out of the Bucks range and that he might end up being a lottery pick just with how he's been performing in workouts, because getting a 7-footer that can shoot, defend, Like that's a dream type of big in the NBA at this point.
Yeah, a decent amount of variance on him because you've started to see a handful more that have him somewhere around 15. It started where he was linked to the Bucks quite a bit, and then he started to move up to 21, 20 or so. Phoenix and the Cavs teams that were linked to him. And now you've started to see more and more of late teens that maybe he could end up breaking into the lottery. It's not the greatest comp. It's not an exact comp, I should say. But I think part of it too is, granted, they came up short, but some of those skill sets that he possesses, the overall fact that he is, I think you would say, untapped in terms of his potential on offense. He has the ability to finish around the rim, to be a good rim protector. The shooting, again, didn't see a high volume of it, but the shooting was there in college. And he can, I've seen varying reports on his switch ability. Definitely can take on the 4s and 5s, but rim protection and his ability to give you some fluidity and movement is what intrigues you. And it's hard not to see all that and say, well, look at what Dallas got last year with Derek Lively, giving you a lot of the same. So I wonder if part of that is going to be teams being prisoner of the moment and saying, well, this guy can be our Derek Lively.
I mean, NBA is a copycat league. You see something work and you try to do it on your own terms. Like, I mean, think about when the Warriors were doing the small ball. Everybody was like, we need a small ball lineup. We have to have a def lineup. Like, that's just the way it works. And seeing the way that Lively was able to contribute, knowing his role, being just great at being that role man and playing defense, being able to get some real good minutes for a contributor to a team that made it to the NBA Finals. Like, of course, you would want a Derek Lively on your team. And Ware has some of those same traits, as you mentioned. Like, and he also had a pretty good assist rate for a big man as well. So he can block, pretty decent rebounder. Like, he shoots the three. He's a good role man. He's a lob threat. Like, those are the things that you would look for in a big. So to your point about everybody trying to find the next Derek Lively, like, I mean, I'm not saying he is it, but he has a profile that resembles what Lively did as well.
Yeah, I think the other name that makes the most sense for the Bucks to be linked to, we'll get to coming up after the break here. The whole, just to close the book on Kelly Ware, it goes back to the conversation we've had about this team over the course of the offseason, in that what they do with that first round pick, I think, does largely depend on who's available where they pick. He's more of a ceiling player than a very high floor player that we feel like, okay, this is a guy that's going to contribute immediately. Not to say that he can't, but I think there's some other prospects in this draft that you would look at and say, this guy, we feel like can step in right now and give us 15 minutes, no questions asked, maybe even a little bit more, and contribute. And that may be short-sighted thinking when you say, well, this is an aging roster. You want somebody that is going to continue to blossom and grow. But it's just part of the evaluation of where the Bucks are and what they're faced with their roster constraints and everything else. Kelly Ware, again, very tantalizing. I think the big pieces that you come back to are the motor piece of it all. And as much as you love what you see there, and you got to start to think about life after Brook Lopez, that's an interesting piece because of the whole, this is a team full of pretty high motor guys that you have. Certainly Giannis that you would point to. And the other part too, he's a Little Rock, Arkansas native. So assuming Bobby Portis is still on the team, what does that do for that connection and helping bring him along? I'm sure that would be a big, big piece of it all as well. Speaking of big pieces, another name that I mentioned that has been linked to the Bucks in several of these mock drafts, a little bit of the opposite of what we described here with Kelly Ware. We'll get into that conversation and that specific player coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That is the winning formula for any championship. And it is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to keep your car leveled up and perform to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit, only available to U.S. customers. All right, Camille, that other name that I mentioned, which we've seen a decent amount of these mock drafts and others speculating, is this guy would make sense for the Bucks, and he's probably going to be there. I would go as far as saying I'm more confident this player will be available at 23 than Kel'el Ware. That is Day'Ron Holmes of Dayton. So we'll get into everything we've seen in the write-ups and whatnot on Day'Ron Holmes. I clearly saw him play one time this season. That was in the NCAA tournament in their matchup with the Arizona Wildcats. But he is more, I think, the consensus of, not to say there isn't the potential there, but I think when you comp him to Kel'el Ware again has that untapped potential, has the ceiling. I think Day'Ron Holmes is more of I think we kind of know what he's going to be. Maybe he surprises us and shows us some growth a little bit, but in all likelihood, he is probably a 6th, 7th man, something like that. He can spot start for you. In some aspects, similar to Bobby Portis. We've seen the comps thrown out there of Naz Reid and his ability to defend in that sense. His three-point shooting ability, he was above 40%, granted only about 2.5 attempts per game a season ago. But I think the difference here, and he's not the elite rim protector, obviously, that Kel'el Ware was. Difference here is I feel like he is more of a finished product where kind of what we said before of who can step in and we feel like we know what we're going to get. And that's, a guy that can contribute to this team. I think Day'Ron Holmes would fit that a little more than Kel'el Ware. Granted, you have more upside with Ware.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the comp that I've seen most used with Day'Ron Holmes, which is Naz Reid. Just people feel like with his size and that he can defend the post in a similar way to Naz Reid. Plus, he can space the floor a bit. I mean, the 3-point shooting for him as well is one of those things where you're like, okay, is this real improvement that we saw? Because this season he shot a very, very good percentage from 3. While the year prior to that, it just wasn't as great. So it's a thing with him as well. Like, how real is this 3-point shot that you have? But he's great in the pick and roll. He's a great pick and roll finisher. I did see too that he grew over 2 inches while he got to college. So he's getting used to also playing with a little bit of a bigger body. He's a great, great shot blocker. Like, that's probably what he does the best on defense. There are some concerns, but also some people who see promise in his ability to defend the rim as well as get out in space and switch. Some people are saying he might be a little too slow to be switching all the time, but some think that he has some upside to be able to learn how to do that better. Not a great rebounder for what he normally does, but outside of that, like, he has a lot of the tools where you look at, like, this could be a great, like, big for any team, but we're talking about the Bucks in particular. I saw in Athletic that there might be some overlap between him and Portis a little bit with what they can do. But again, one of the hopes is that defensively that he can be quick enough to switch. Some think he might be a little bit too small to play in that drop coverage, but he is 6'10", so there are some tools that he has just physically where you think, like, maybe with some development, maybe if you sit behind Brook Lopez for a year, that's someone who you can really learn from. But he's a really interesting prospect for the Bucks and somebody who I wouldn't be mad at if they took a shot on him.
Yeah, the more highlights, I'm not going to say film, but highlights we've seen of him, and the more you've really gotten into the breakdowns, I lean towards this as the guy that if you keep the pick, I think would make the most sense for the Bucks, and I would be most pleased with seeing, for all the reasons that you pointed out. And I think defensively too, everything that you see about Day'Ron Holmes is he really thrives in the pick and roll. that he's a very, very good defender there. Again, maybe not switchable per se, because you're not going to be throwing him out there on for extended coverages on twos and point guards and whatnot.
Right.
But especially in that middle of the floor pick and roll, and that is a spot that, as long as you have Damian Lillard, we mentioned on the show yesterday, hey, maybe you get Malik Beasley back on a vet minimum. As long as you got those guys on the floor, you are going to be susceptible to teams running pick and roll against you. And that's a spot where he thrives. We mentioned the comp to Naz Reid. You mentioned some of the overlap potentially with Bobby Portis. I think the other piece of it is this. Rim protection, as you pointed out, that was one of the other things of, surprisingly, he's pretty good at it as a help side rim protector. Again, when we talk about a copycat league, you go back to Boston. This guy, and comping college to the pros is different with the space on the floor for those 3-point attempts. As we said, it's about 2.5 3-point attempts per game that he averaged. But when you watch his shot, everything else about it, he is a 5-out guy. And when you look at what Boston did, 5-out, they were the team that really perfected the 5-out approach. And that was because Al Horford could hold up defensively when they played the two bigs together. Al Horford could hold up, more than hold up defensively. He can knock down shots. Kristaps Porzingis was, through the years, a very underrated rim protector. And man, that really showed in the finals too, especially in game one. He's a guy, Day'Ron Sharpe, that we're talking about here, that I know we mentioned the comps to Naz Reid. If you just think about that system and how the Celtics played, I think you could talk yourself into, maybe not necessarily this year, but down the road, yeah, this guy is an Al Horford type, that he can pick up a couple of spots, maybe not quite as versatile as we've seen Al Horford the last few years defensively, but still has that versatility, ability to defend the pick and roll. He can play 5-out and pop that 3-pointer. He's a decent enough help side rim protector. And you got this guy named Giannis, who is a very, very good rim protector himself, that can come over and take the rest, a la Kristaps Porzingis. So the more we dig into it, I think he is, between he and Kel'el Ware, he is the one of those two that is more likely to be there at 23. And frankly, he's the player that I think I've talked myself into the most throughout this process.
And I can see why, because on top of that too, we didn't even mention the fact he's just a smart player as well. Like, he's really good on cuts, knowing when to rim. He always boxes out. Like, he is just somebody who, even on defense, when he's getting back, he has his hands up. He's a willing defender as well. And so a lot of conversations this final about the role of effort in defense as well. And with Holmes, like, effort is there. He is going to be out there, hands up, doing what he's supposed to do. So, I can absolutely see why he's someone who you've been like, yeah, this is the one for me. Because he's also just, if I ordered him, he's top of the list, right behind Ware for me. And I saw too, he also had he's a good passer. He had a 19% assist rate. I was like, that's interesting for a big man. So he has a lot of tools and skill sets about him that makes him really interesting for the Bucks. And like you mentioned, he has been mocked to the Bucks as well. So he's somebody who, like you said, could realistically still be on the board at 23 when the Bucks do make that pick, if they make that pick.
Yeah, his passing ability, his overall offensive IQ, playmaking, and kind of the opposite conversation that we had towards the end there about Kel'el Ware. His motor is unquestioned. And, the other thing I've seen through a handful of these write-ups on him is he was very well coached and open to coaching at Dayton. And I think that, along with all of the different looks and versatility and schemes that Dayton ran defensively, has made him very, very well prepared for the NBA level. That I've seen a handful say just what we said at the top, that this is a guy that I think he's going to be productive in his early years in the league because of all of that, because of the different looks that he played in, the coaching that he's been open to, his ability to be a playmaker, and overall offensive IQ that he has. That this is a guy, as we mentioned, it comes down to, is there somebody there that can help us in the future and now, that step in and contribute? This is a guy that seems to check those boxes. So that is, as of this moment, as we record this Wednesday, 1 week before the draft, It's going to change, I would assume, over the course of the next 6 or 7 days. But that's the guy that I would say, if he's there, that's who I want the Bucks to take. A couple of other names to get to, and one of them has some local ties to the Bucks. So we will get into the rest of the bigs in this draft coming up next here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at FanDuel. As it is summertime, that means baseball, and you can bet on it at FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $200 that you can use on everything. Whether you want to know who's going to throw the next no-hitter, who's going to hit it out of the park. Maybe we see another cycle. You can bet on all of that on FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Add a big win to your summer bucket list when you do so. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And if you are watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to constantly turn down the volume because of all of that shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you every day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Camille, I mentioned there is a local name that is out there that we have seen, I don't know if I'd say linked to the Bucks, but you've seen him pop up in those spots where the Bucks would potentially be picking. We questioned before too, when we were first getting into here are the names that the Bucks worked out. You started to hear some of those rumblings of, hey, this is a guy that I've heard is working out for the Bucks, and that was confirmed. Let's just start preface with this. I don't think, unless something drastic changes here, he is not going to be taken at 23. This is more of a second round option that we're viewing here. But somebody that you're very familiar with your Marquette ties there, Camille, and I think by mentioning Biggs and Marquette, everybody knows
Yes, sir.
who we're referring to.
Oh, so Iguodaro. Now, he is such an interesting prospect because the type of big man that he is, he's an offensive hub, right? He is somebody who he gets the ball like the elbow and he can operate out of there. A really gifted passer, a really smart player as well. He's one of those guys where you think about, well, what does he do well? And it's like he does quite a few things well. Like, what does he do badly? And you're like, well, it's not as much. He's kind of just like a jack of all trades in a certain degree, but he doesn't do anything necessarily in an elite way. Not a great shooter from 3-point range. That's not in his bag, but he has just like this really interesting floater. He loves getting that floater up at all different angles, different spaces. That and his little hook shot, like that's like his primary offense, but he's great in transition. Defensively, he's a smart defender. He might be a little undersized coming up to the NBA, but the way he can pass the ball and just be a hub offensively, it makes you think of like I'm not saying he's at that level, but just how he kind of runs his offense a little bit like a Sabonis type without the 3-point shot there. Most of his shots come at the rim. He's high IQ, good feel for the game, great passer, like I mentioned, decent rebounder as well. He's good in the pick and roll, pretty good in transition as well. Like he is just an overall good big. But as I mentioned, he is a non-shooter from 3-point. He doesn't really stretch the floor in that way. So I'll be really interested to see where he fits in the NBA level, because I think for him more than a lot of other players, where he ends up will determine a lot about his career, because he's such an interesting and kind of unique type of big man.
And I know you're not saying it's a perfect fit, but that Sabonis comp is actually pretty spot on, pretty interesting as well, where I think you would look at it as because of the hub piece that you mentioned. Sabonis also not, I think he has the ability, but he just does not take the 3-point shot. More of a, I suppose the comp would be like a Kmart version of Sabonis offensively, but much more defensive value that he's going to add than Domas does. I think the interesting part is there's something there that I think, look, you look at teams like through the years, the Spurs, the Miami Heat, certainly the best example of this, where they find that one thing and say, okay, this is your strength. How do we continue to develop this? And how do we fit this into what we're doing and really highlight this while kind of hiding some of your weaknesses? I think the best example we've seen the Bucks do with that recently is AJ Green, when we talked about he has this one elite skill set. Credit to him for getting better. And I don't know if that's even fair, that I think we all kind of assumed he was bad defensively, but he was above average, I would say, defensively this past season, that he more than held his own. And that's what you need with a guy like Oso is, okay, this is what works for you. And here's where we can fit it in around us on the floor, but we got to look for ways to minimize the downside. And again, the Heat are the best example of finding that and developing that with players. I think he is more of a long-term play, not to say that it couldn't have some flashes throughout his rookie season, but that's more of a, okay, if the Bucks do not keep their first-round pick and it's part of a trade, maybe they do some other tinkering to the roster. I feel pretty confident in saying that Oso is going to be there at 33 when the Bucks pick in the second round, and probably even at the midpoint of that second round. So maybe that's somebody that you can get later in the second round if there's another move that's involved, or it's kind of hit or miss. I think the ceiling on him right now is mid to somewhat early second round. The floor is, this guy is not going to be drafted, and we've seen that through the years with a handful of Marquette guys. Justin Lewis still developing in Chicago with the Bulls on their G League team.
Yeah, one comp I saw to also that made me kind of laugh because he also had a Bucks tie was Mamu Kelishvili. Like he kind of reminds me of Mamu, and I was like, that's an interesting comp. And we've seen how Mamu's career has gone. Like when he went to the Spurs, I was like, that could be a really great landing spot for him, because if anyone can kind of figure out how to use a center, a big that has just a talent for passing, it could be Pop. But we still haven't been able to really see him get on the floor consistently. I mean, now they have Wemby, of course, but even prior to that, just hasn't been consistent for him. So that was one of those comps where I was like, that's interesting, because I do remember when we had Mamu and being like, he's a different type of big, like just with his passing ability and what he can do on the floor. But as a Marquette alum, wearing the shirt now, actually, as we speak, I do hope that Oso just lands in the spot that he can develop, because I don't think that him coming into the league right now is like he's going to give you 15, 20 minutes a game. Like, I don't think he's at that point yet. So he's going to need some development in his game, but he has some really interesting tools that I think a team's going to want to take a shot on.
And actually, I should clean that up, as Justin Lewis was undrafted, signed with the Bulls, playing with their G League team. Then he was traded to the Jazz's G League affiliate. He is now out of the G League and playing in the Canadian Elite Basketball League. But the local ties there with Oso. And of all the bigs out there, two other names that we touched on heavily that seem to be linked to the Bucks fairly often here in this draft. There's Zach Edey as well. We saw the Bucks work him out. He's going to be very polarizing. I don't think Zach Edey is going to be there at 23 when the Bucks are drafting. Tyler Smith of the G League Ignite, another name that we didn't touch on here, but another name that we've seen linked to the Bucks, or I don't know if linked to the Bucks is accurate as much as it's in that range in these mock drafts. Any other names that you had in mind that you wanted to touch on here?
I saw it in the comment as well, but Yves Messiah.
Yeah.
If I'm pronouncing that wrong, but just a dog on defense, high flyer. He is somebody offensively where when I looked at his profile, like he shot 97% of his field goal attempts at the rim. And I was like, well, he knows what he's good at right here. But defensively, like he just has all of those tools that you're looking for. The thing for him is going to be just some of the offensive, how he can stretch the floor in that way, because not a great free throw shooter at this point as well, not a great passer, but the defense, the rebounding, all of that comes with it. He can lob threat. He has athleticism. He is just a really interesting prospect where I'm not sure exactly where he's going to be. I commonly see him in the 20s, as high as 19, low as like 26, 27 on some mock drafts. So he's just somebody to keep an eye on as well. I could see someone falling in love with that defense because he's also somebody who had a really quick growing spurt and went from playing guard to center. So just him continuing to develop, he could be a really interesting prospect.
Yeah, I think he's around there too. Most of the mocks I've seen have him at around 20 to 25. The other one to mention, I suppose, and this is more of the, again, not a project per se, but more of the longer term play and saying, hey, all right, let's develop something here. I don't want to comp him to Giannis, but similar to what the Bucks were able to get with Giannis of, you know what, let's try this guy. He has some things that he like. But I've seen a lot of fluctuation in where he's slotted to go in this draft, even in the second round, potentially. That is Bobby Klintman of Sweden and his ability as a shooter. Some of the write-ups I've seen too of, man, you could play super big. Essentially, I've seen varying reports in his height too. I'll say 6'9". I've seen 6'8", 6'10". He's got a 7-foot wingspan though, but he's a very good shooter. He's more of, I wouldn't say a wing per se, but more of a forward, than a big. So he's one of the interesting names out there as well. But if it's a big, I feel pretty confident in saying it's going to be one of the names that we've mentioned on the show.
Yeah, I think so as well. But we'll see because, for as many bigs as we talked about today, just going through the draft, and when we get to the wings, I was just like, wow, like there's quite a few options in that range where the Bucks are going to be drafting, where there are some prospects, depending on how you want to do it, where they could be a really interesting fit as well. So the closer we always get to the draft, the more excited I get for the draft every single year. It's without fail. And this year, I'm really interested in seeing how it plays out with the draft being over 2 days now, because I do wonder if we might actually have more trades and more movement after the first round closes, because there's a whole night to think about.
More time.
Yeah, there's time in between the rounds now. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out this year with this new format.
Time between the rounds on its own day. So it's not, 5 minutes between picks and teams towards the end of the night. Just let's get this day over with already. So that's going to be fascinating to see how the second round plays out here. I believe we mentioned this briefly on the show yesterday, but I think we're planning on doing some variants of a live show for the first round of the draft 1 week from tonight on Wednesday night. We still got to hammer out the details there, but thinking probably starting somewhere around the midpoints of the draft so we can start to see what's unfolded so far, especially if there's any trades that have been made, and then get that Bucks pick and reaction to that pick. I'm not sure Frank is going to join us or not, but we do plan on getting Frank's reaction to the draft either that night or in a separate show that we would run the next day. So we do have that planned for the draft. Tomorrow, we are going to take a look at the wings. That, again, realistic options for the Bucks, and we'll wrap up our look at the prospects Friday, taking a look at guards that the Bucks have shown an interest in and have been linked to and have a realistic shot at selecting in this draft. Before we do wrap up, one thing that you and I talked about before we started recording, just to float this out there, this is not going to take away from the 5 days a week that you get Bucks content. So I just want to preface with that. But as you know, if you follow us on social and listening to Locked On Bucks, watching Locked On Bucks, Camille and I are both fans of the sweet science that is professional wrestling. So I think we're going to start doing a weekly show recapping the week in wrestling. It is not going to take away from the 5 Bucks shows that we're putting out there that you're getting Monday through Friday. This would probably run on the weekend. If you're not into it, you don't have to listen to the show. There's going to be no Bucks content in it. We're not going to force it in to any of the other Bucks related shows throughout the week either. So you have to skip forward and whatnot. If you don't like it, just don't listen to it. Come back for the rest of the Bucks content throughout the course of the week. But I do think it's something we're probably going to toy with starting to do as a weekend exclusive show where you can get your fix if you're one of those fans as well. So if you have thoughts on that, certainly leave them in the comments or reach out to Camille and I on social media. But again, I just cannot stress enough. It's not going to replace a Bucks show throughout the weeks. You're not getting only 4 Bucks shows. You're getting an extra show. And if you're not into it, you're not into it. It's not going to take away from any of that. So if it's something you're into, let us know. I think we're going to start doing that eventually. Maybe we'll tie into some of the PLEs that are coming up here in the coming weeks, but something to satiate the rest of the fans, because they're out there. We know they are. We see you lurking in the comments that are also Bucks fans. So yeah, leave your thoughts on that. Either comment on today's show or on social media with Camille and I. But that'll do it for today's show. Again, tomorrow we're going to take a look at the wings in this draft and wrap up the week taking a look at guards on Friday. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.